Welcome to VR Hermits, a podcast about virtual reality development. I'm Dave Ramsey.
And I'm Joe Simpson. How's it going, Dave?
Doing really good, Joe. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. We got a pretty cool VR lineup of topics today. You want to start talking about VR input?
Sure.
So this is something we kind of touched on last week. I said I was going to be spending a lot of time with user interface, like menus and controller input this week. So that was a big part of my focus. And mixed results. I ended the week with some pretty cool stuff, but it took a lot of steps to get there and just a lot of trying different things. And I'm still not quite where I want to be, but after I explained to you the three different things I tried, at least the three things that were topical anyway, then maybe you can help me figure out how to get to where I want to go.
Okay.
So I'm using the SteamVR asset pack in Unity, and I've been using, up until now, I've been using the SteamVR interaction system. There is a player prefab that's in the core folder of that, and I just made a copy of that and customized it for what I needed, and I've been using that in pretty much both of the projects up until this point. And when I started the first attempt at making a menu, obviously the first thing I wanted to do was be able to toggle the menu on and off with the application menu button. So on the Vive controllers, that's the little button right above the trackpad. I'm not really sure where it's at on the touch controllers on Oculus, but there's a button that maps to the same input there. Mm-hmm. And on the Windows controller, it's kind of a little button next to the trackpad and underneath the D-pad, or underneath the thumbstick. So all three devices have a button that maps to the same input, and I just want to toggle a menu, either a 2D or 3D menu on and off. And that was not easy to do using the interaction toolkit. Everything that I've learned about Unity so far tells me that polling for input is probably a waste of time. So I should be using events for that, particularly Unity's event system. So, I did some Googling around, and of course the one blog that I ended up on was that Unity 3D College blog that we mentioned a couple weeks ago. Mm-hmm. He's got a pretty good write-up of how to use input with SteamVR, but that blog post isn't using the interaction toolkit. It's using the regular SteamVR camera rig. So after some kind of just Googling around, it pretty much looks like there are two branches you can go down, two roads you can pick when you are working with SteamVR. The first, and what seems like what most people are doing, is you ignore the interaction toolkit entirely, since most people don't even realize it's there. There is a prefab in the, up at the same level above that. There's a prefabs folder, and in there's a camera rig prefab. You drag that into your scene. It's made up of the camera rig and some default controller objects, and does some really basic things. It tracks the controllers, and then you can attach a component called the I think it's SteamVR tracked controller component to those, left and right hand controllers or whatever they're called. You can attach that component to it, and then you can write a class, attach it to that same object, get the component, and attach event listeners to that. And that's pretty much, that's a nice, it's not super elegant, but it's a clean way of only getting those inputs when they're actually being pressed without actually polling them on every frame,
right? Which
could get kind of annoying. But that same workflow, attaching the track controller component, doesn't work with the hands that are set up in the interaction toolkit or interaction system. So that player prefab is customized by Valve much, much more. It does a lot more. It's built in such a way that you drag kind of behaviors into the scene, like the teleportation ability. You drag in a teleportation prefab, and the hands just inherit the ability to be able to teleport. Same thing, if it detects objects that are interactable, it can just interact with them. What they didn't account for is actually allowing you to get your own button input from those controllers when you're using that. And the only way to do that I've found is actually just to use the base classes that the event systems are looking at and go out and actually pull by frame and get those buttons that way. But it's obviously not an ideal way of doing that. So I have both working. I've got some different versions in the same sandbox scene, and I can get both of them working. As far as the menu goes, obviously I don't have interaction on the camera prefab because I would have to code all that myself. And none of the components in the interaction system are really compatible with the other system. So it's kind of like I have to pick which direction do I want to go. Do I want to start from scratch but have really good input, or do I want to start with almost everything I need and then code my own input? And I spent some time kind of going back and forth with those, talked to some other developers. Everybody was kind of having the same issue. And then I tried a couple other things throughout the week. I took a look at something called Newton VR, which is an abstraction layer for SteamVR and the Oculus dev kit. And it was okay, but wasn't quite what I was looking for. And then at some point I tried the Vive Input plugin, or Vive Input Utility, I think it's called. So this is made by Vive, not Valve, but HTC. And they made a little abstraction layer that surprisingly, despite the fact that it has Vive in the name, it also supports Oculus and Daydream and a couple other controllers. And it's not documented, but it's also working now with the Windows mixed reality controllers. So neat. The first time I tried that early in the week, it wasn't working with the Windows mixed reality stuff. Like the camera prefab was all messed up, but they released an update on Friday that seemed to fix all those issues. So I've been using that since Saturday late morning, it was great to get that up and running, but it would have been nice if I had found it 3 days earlier before I spent 3 days trying to make my own stuff.
Right.
So the Vive Input Utility, it's got some really nice examples of how to, just working with Unity's event system, get these inputs from the controllers and work on them accordingly. And they even give you some sample classes that you can use or duplicate and modify. So that's what I've done so far. And they do give you some basic interaction stuff. I don't know if I would actually ship it. I'd probably want to just replace it. But they do give you ways to be able to pick up objects and teleport around the scene, things like that. Their teleportation thing was both really cool and need to work. The cool thing about it is it's just a component you attach to an object that you want to be able to teleport on, which in the SteamVR teleportation framework, you drag in the teleportation game object, and then anywhere you want to teleport, you have to either put a teleport point prefab where you want those little dots you can teleport on, or a teleport area, which is made up of another mesh right above the floor. So if you get a large floor, you can put another mesh right above it, just a tiny bit above it, and you can teleport around on that surface. But it doesn't really work well in like rocky terrain or hills or things like that. The one that Vive has, you just attach a component to the entire landscape I'm working with, and now the entire landscape is teleportable. So it's kind of cool that way. It's also not without its problems because half of the landscape is underwater. Now you can just teleport right underwater. So maybe don't want that. There are other approaches out there, like teleporting using navigation meshes, and you can kind of calculate the navigation mesh based on where the water is. So that may be somewhere to go in the future. But yeah, that was a lot of talking.
Teleport underwater, just make them drown.
Yeah. Or just fall through the world. Yeah, at some point, I'm going to make a scene. Like, people are going to escape these islands somehow if I give them enough navigation. So I do want to put a very long stack of turtles underneath the world. Just to validate some claims.
See, you go turtles all the way down, and I go Discworld.
Yeah.
That it's underneath the world is 4 giant elephants who are all standing on the back of one single humongous turtle.
Mm-hmm. The funny thing about the turtles all the way down thing is that everybody says it's from a different person. It's one of those things that people attribute to like half a dozen people. And I know it, I mean, I don't know that this is true, but I know it as a William James anecdote. I heard it from a philosopher on YouTube that he was giving a public seminar on William James and told this anecdote. But I've heard it from many other people as well, so who knows?
I'm sure there's a version somewhere where Socrates said it, but he stole it from somebody else. So
yeah, who knows at this point? So yeah, that's a lot of work to just get the the application button up and running. And like I say, it's working now. So the next step was to actually, I guess before I stop that, do you have any questions about inputs so far?
I just think that some of the people who are designing some of these interaction and coding systems should probably listen to you speak on these topics and just go, okay, add that to the to-do list and that. And even the ones where you know you've got a really good answer, it just means that you're missing on documentation. Like, we need to properly document that there is a really simple answer to this problem. It's named funny or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, the SteamVR plugin, the team making that, they need oversight or project management or something. They need somebody asking questions before they ship new updates, because like I'm no expert at this, but I am an expert at making software and making sure shoddy stuff doesn't get out the door. And that's kind of what it feels like. Hey, we have an entire interaction toolkit. You don't think anybody's going to want to push buttons, right? Nah, don't worry about it.
Yeah. There's a guy I used to work with who was of the opinion that you could get some amazing stuff if you let developers run amok. Like they could turn out just outstanding, powerful products that were almost entirely unusable by anybody other than them. Mm-hmm. And then at some point you needed either as like project management or even just to a certain degree as documentation. Like you needed somebody who doesn't know the technology, whose job is to write up how you do all this stuff. And when they write it up, they're going to go, hey, wait a second, there's all these other buttons on the controller. Do you guys have something for that? I mean, the answer can be, it will come later, but somebody's got to ask the question.
Yeah, and the Vive input utility, this is just speculation on my part, but I have the feeling, just based on the forums that I read on Viveport, I get the sense that so many people were not getting a response from Valve on their forums that they started going to Viveport and asking HTC for help. And at some point, some project manager in HTC noticed enough of these complaints to say, well, if Valve's not going to do anything about it, we may as well make something to like reduce these numbers of identical tickets. Because I think they were getting bombarded with so many people with the same question. So they just put out their own thing. And it's pretty good. And it's documented and easy to use. So.
Yeah, there's a support model that I've been trying to adopt recently, which is always targeting, regardless of the value that I might place on a particular feature, the feature that is filling the most time in the support system, either via small numbers with high complexity of handling the support, or lots and lots of incidences, whatever it is that's consuming time in your support process, to code to that. And it ends up reducing your support time, which gives you all this other time back to do other stuff. Works really well as an independent developer. I don't know necessarily how that works when you've got a 50-person team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No idea. So yeah, any questions about input?
At this point, my only question is yours, which is why is it still so complicated? But
yeah, and this was another one of those trade-offs between Unity and Unreal, where this is one of those things you just don't even have to deal with, at least with the Vive controllers. I haven't tried the other controllers in Unreal Engine, but it's just built into the engine. You go into the project settings and go to the input tab and define your inputs, and they're just built in. The controllers, all the buttons are mapped out. You just pick which ones you want to do what, and then you can call them in code or blueprints. So it just feels just like another one of those trade-offs, like you get this, but you have to deal with blueprints. Or you get to deal with blueprints, depending on...
Congratulations.
Yeah. But overall, I think I'll definitely stick with Unity for ease of use. But it's just one of those things, like having known a better way, it just kind of bugs me that it's this complicated. So the other area that I wanted to talk about is VR menus. And we've talked about this a little bit the last couple of weeks. I initially wanted to not do VR menus. I wanted to do 3D interactive objects as menus and just kind of get away from the entire user interface paradigm. But then I thought about how convenient it is for some apps to be able to set up the settings with a mouse and keyboard before putting the headset on. So I wanted to kind of keep that as well. So I decided to go back to working with menus. And I built a pretty simple menu system. It's definitely a placeholder to be replaced by something else. For nothing else, it's completely flat, and I really want to do one of those curved UIs. But right now I'm just using the stock Unity canvas, and I've got 12 buttons and some images attached to them. So I'm using the button component. I swapped out the image component, which is made for sprites, with the raw image component, which you can put any texture in. So I used a little nice feature in Gaia. They've got a snapshot utility, so you can just point a camera anywhere in the scene while it's running and hit a button to create a snapshot. And I just found some nice views of the 3 scenes that I've got in the project and made some snapshots and then used those for the images in the navigation. So at this point I've got, basically it's 3 columns of 4 buttons. Only 3 of them actually have images on them. The other ones are just kind of placeholders for the other scenes when they come. And it's as simple as just pointing the controller and using a laser pointer and the trigger to select. And so it's simple in result. I'm using that in conjunction with the Vive Input laser pointer. So they've got a nice little laser pointer that worked pretty well. The SteamVR laser pointer is an abomination. It's just, I don't know if it's just an example of how to make a laser, and then they just kind of left it at that, but it doesn't actually do anything. And it doesn't really intersect objects. You have to do all that yourself. And I got it working kinda, but sometimes the laser would just decide it wasn't going to be very long for no reason. Like, I'm just going to be a foot long and just call it a day. And then sometimes it would stop doing that. And sometimes toggling the menu on with the laser pointed at where the menu would show up would just immediately trigger a collider on the menu button and trigger the click event. So it wasn't good.
Joe, now that I think about it, your product should be a developer toolkit for making VR easier.
There are some of those out there.
Yes, but you should make one that actually does all the stuff that you need it to do.
No. I just want to use one of those. I really don't want to make one.
Okay.
I'm hoping you'll get frustrated into making one.
But
I know there's no XML parsing involved. So.
Well, but there could be. I mean, what was the old quote? XML is like violence. If it's not solving your problem, you're not using enough of it.
Ouch. So moving on.
It's not my quote. I didn't make that one up.
So the SteamVR laser wasn't really working for me. So what I really want is, I don't want a laser pointer just attached to the thing all the time. I want, when you click the application button, the laser pointer also shows up and you can use it to select inside the menu. But when you click it again, the menu goes away and the laser goes away. So that's what I was able to set up with the Vive Input stuff and get that working. It's a bit easier to deal with as well, because you just, with the way that I was doing it with the Steam laser pointer and following Jason's blog again with how to use it with interactions, I had to attach a component to every single UI object in the canvas. And the way that Vive has it set up with their laser stuff, you just attach it to the canvas and then it kind of, everything inherits from that object. So It's a bit easier to set up. So there are some really cool menu options out there in VR. I'm meeting with some other developers this week to talk about the prototype as a whole, and one of the things we'll talk about is menus, but there's a lot we can do. There's some really cool curved UI stuff in the asset store. There's some good stuff on blogs. I just haven't dived into any of it yet. And then I'm trying to figure out how people are getting that kind of pause screen effect. So some games, when you bring up the menu, it tends to dim the entire surrounding and just show you your UI. It almost seems like you're changing scenes. And then I was thinking, like, maybe they are changing scenes, or maybe they're loading a second scene on top of where the user is. So I need to investigate that and see if that's what's happening. Like, if you can just make a menu scene somewhere else in the project, you would have to load it. It would have to kind of always be loaded and ready to go to be that responsive, because you can't just transition to it and wait for it to load for 3 to 5 seconds. But if it's light enough, it could be kind of cool just to lay out your entire menu canvas or 3D menu, like a hub or whatever, in just another scene. And then when you push the application button, it loads that other scene, or like activates it, enables it or whatever, disables the other scene, or maybe keeps it just so you can't interact with it, or you've got a collider around the menu scene so none of your inputs can escape it and interfere with the other world. I don't know, there could be some cool stuff there. I just need to see if any of that's possible. I may just be making up impossible things again.
I mean, my first guess would be there's a big translucent plane just behind your menus. And it moves with the headset, so everywhere you look, you just can't see any further than the other things. There could be some weird clipping issues there.
Yeah. One of the things I want to do with my menu is just attach a collider to it that's just big enough, like it spawns like a meter in front of the user, and they can just use a laser pointer to select things. I want to make a sphere collider that encompasses the menu and where the user is standing when they bring up the menu, and then use that as a trigger when they leave that collider to dismiss the menu. So just kind of clean up after they go, because they can just walk away from it.
If it's a sphere that's big enough, though, you might end up with too much. Maybe just a smaller sphere that covers, head times 2.
Mm-hmm.
So so you don't have to leave a large sphere, you can leave a relatively small sphere that's independent of any of these display effects or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so trying to get a 2D menu to actually show up where I wanted it to was a whole morning of just banging my head on vector math, and then eventually getting help.
Yeah.
From one of the developers at the co-working space. So it's just weird. I don't have that laptop in front of me with all the code, but I had to position the thing in a certain way and then rotate it in a certain way, and both of them were a challenge. But basically, I wanted the menu to show up a meter in front of wherever the user was facing, which wasn't necessarily the forward vector of the VR object. Mm-hmm. It was the forward direction of the camera. So it was a bit hard to figure that out. And eventually, how do I get that position, and then how do I normalize that onto a plane? Because I can be looking up when I hit the menu, but I still want it to appear at the same spot right in front of me, not up in the air or down on the ground, like wedged in. And then how do I rotate that in such a way that it's only rotating on the axis that I care about? So yeah, it was I don't remember the exact functions, but it was a lot of, subtracting this vector from that vector and normalizing stuff. And I need to get better at that type of stuff, because I felt really stupid. It was one of those things, like, we've all been there in other languages, like you're struggling with what seems like a really hard problem, and somebody else just says, "Oh, you just blah blah blah," and they type in like 3 functions, and there you go. That's all you needed.
Yeah, when I was playing with 2D stuff, it was always a thing of like, the entire world is moving past the camera, but I need this one object to not move and not rotate and not do the things that everything else in the entire world is doing. And as soon as something in the world deviates from the pattern of everything else, suddenly it gets very complicated. And none of the math ever makes sense to me. So, unfortunately, when you bump into those kinds of problems, you really can't call me.
Not yet.
Well, not until I've released my mathematical rotation VR kit tool to the store.
Yeah,
Sure.
one of the blog posts I was reading today, it was actually a blog post on extensions and C#, and particularly in Unity. And Jason, who writes this blog, made a good case for using extensions. He kind of keeps a library of common extensions that he uses from project to project. And these types of kind of repetitive, but how do I do that again, functions are a good example of things that he would use in extensions. Like, let me just extend the transform class to make a direction to or direction from method on that. So he's got some examples on his blog I'm going to take a look at and kind of add to my own toolkit. Like, I totally do that with FileMaker and other languages. I just haven't done that so far with Unity.
That's actually one of my favorite things to dig into in somebody else's code is where their extensions are. Like the things that they wanted to be able to use all the time when they were interacting with stuff. And hopefully those sections are well commented so I can understand what the heck is going on. But
yeah, like you could just make a utility class and kind of include those, but the way he was doing it, just like, let's extend the transform class itself so you can use these new functions on any transform across the project.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I miss in C# from Swift is Swift will let you do extension properties. So you can actually just like basically make an extension that will give you something kind of like a function, but it doesn't have to have parentheses. It's just you added an extension variable to the object class. And it's just nice to be able to differentiate properties from functions that do things or methods.
Yeah.
My head, once I made the adaptation in Swift, I missed not being able to make the same adaptation in C#. So,
yeah, extensions are pretty cool. I need to take a look at the SteamVR stuff, and particularly like that level loader class I was mentioning. I wonder if I can just use an extension to add the functionality that I want there and just call a different method rather than the one that's being called for the scene loading stuff. So I wanted to talk a little bit about events and why words hurt me.
Okay.
So as I'm struggling with all this, excuse me, as I'm struggling through all of this interaction stuff with the controllers and making menus, I keep breaking my head on the idea of events, and I kind of know what events are in most programming languages, and I thought that's what we were talking about all the time. But I keep seeing these other things in the Unity inspector called event systems that are attached to game objects, and I'm like, what is this thing? What are you doing here? And then there's these events here where I drag in a game object and specify a function and a value based on like an on-click event, and then I can make an event object, like a public variable event object, and show that in the inspector and populate that. Like, this one word is being used too many ways, and I'm confused now. So, I kind of know what events are in C#. I was hoping to get more of an explanation from you since you've worked with them more than I have. But from what I can understand about the C# events, you make a class, you make a delegate to the class, and then you define an event to it. And the event is basically, for lack of a better term, like a queue of things. You can add things to the queue or the list of objects that are listening to it. So we can go away to another class. We can reference the other class that has the events built in, and then we can make a listener to it, and we add our listener to that queue. And the way that you just use the plus equal operators to add that on to that list, and then your class is now listening for that event. So it seems like it's just like subscribing to it is probably a better word than listening.
Different systems will use both of those words.
Yeah. So I kind of understand that concept, but I was getting tripped up by seeing that in code and then also seeing the Unity events in the inspector and those not being the same thing. Like, this code didn't create that event. Where did that come from? I realized that there's this whole other system called the event system in Unity that came out to like version 4.6 or thereabouts, where Unity introduced all this stuff for the new GUI tools and then brought the event system with it, and it's just a whole different thing, and it's kind of confusing. So, and the confusing thing is I'm using both of these things for the SteamVR menu system and input system. So I'm using the C# events to actually get the input from the controller, and I'm using the Unity events to initiate on those events to initiate when to like activate the game objects that are doing the level loading. So and this is just confusing, and I need to find a better way to do this. But currently I'm using that SteamVR load level component, which is a pretty cool way of doing things because it doesn't slam the brakes on your game. It can load asynchronously, and it can throw you into a compositor view where you can still feel like you're in VR and still have some positional movement, but you're just in a holding zone. And you can kind of customize that view and make it look a certain way, but it doesn't like jack the frame rate down and make you sick or just like blank out your screen, things like that. It keeps you in VR even though there's nothing to do for 2 or 3 seconds while the other scene loads. And the only way that I found, well, the lazy way that I have found to use those is they have got a little checkbox at the bottom of the component that just says activate on enable. So I just disable the game object and then use an event later on in the menu. So on my little menu button, there is an on-click event, and then I drag my load level component or load level game object into that, and then specify the game object, and then down to the set active bool and set that to true. So when you click, you activate that, and then the scene transition takes place. So it's a sloppy way of doing that. It's mainly sloppy because I haven't found a way to actually call that load level class in code and just set the names of the levels I want to load dynamically. So I actually just have 3 different load level components for each scene. It's just a string you type in. So I need to kind of see if I can extend that or call that via script and just have one of those rather than 12 eventually. Yeah, it's weird stuff.
So over time, I have developed in my head a useful abstraction for the way that event systems work. And it is not necessarily an accurate abstraction or capture all the variation of the details of how the system works. But so far, it hasn't really led me wrong. So until I bump into a system that works substantively differently, I can continue to use the abstraction, and event systems are pretty easy to understand. And basically, it's just there's a pool somewhere that events are periodically thrown into, and then they kind of disappear. Kind of a timeout sort of thing. They just pop up as like a little firework going off. And so you have things that launch fireworks and things that watch for particular colors of fireworks.
Hmm.
And so it doesn't really matter what the emitter is, and it doesn't really matter what the listener is, but they can each be watching for these things. And then you can also have the ability to have multiple one emitter that emits a particular signal, but multiple listeners that will all listen for that particular firework and respond in different ways, but basically at the same time.
Yeah.
Or multiple emitters that can kick out the same signal, and a single listener that's just listening for anybody who spits out that particular signal.
Mm.
And just kind of throwing away the implementation details in my head. I throw away what the object structures look like and queues and all this kind of stuff. And just kind of go, you got a set of listeners and you got a set of emitters, and then there's signals that appear. And you can make an emitter that generates a signal that nobody's listening for, and that's okay. It's okay.
Mm.
Or you can have a listener that's listening for a signal that's never going to happen. That's also okay.
That's the story of my life.
So, but when those things connect, you can pass a signal across them. And in my head, this is the one that will probably be more contentious. In general, in my head, I think of these event systems primarily as cheats.
Mm-hmm.
And they are cheats for when you don't know what the path is that's going to connect these two objects. You don't you don't know like how to get from point A to point B, because if you could just have A tell B to do something. That's what you would do.
Yeah.
But at some point the path from A to B goes through 37 other objects. And maybe some of those objects are being created and deleted, and so the path between them is constantly changing. And past a particular point, you just kind of have to say, listen, the right move here is to move up an abstraction layer and just fire off a firework and let everybody else respond. Let the people who care notice. And then I don't have to worry about what's in between those two spots. Now, granted, so you could theoretically use an event system to replace all variable passing. All function calls could be done this way.
Don't do that.
No, correct. And that's why I kind of think of it as a cheat. It's like, it's one of those things that I don't want to use except when it's really the only answer. Like, if I can connect A to B directly, just call the function. Just call the method and be done with it. Now, in your case, with the things that you're dealing with, they've used this as a way to loosely couple components. So we've got a thing, and you don't really need to worry about what the thing is, how it works, what its implementation details are, what its object structure is, any of that. We got a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the only part that you have to care about is that periodically the thing will generate one of three messages. And should you care about one of those three messages, you should make your own object that listens for one of those three messages. But you don't have to care about where the thing is or where it exists or where these things are tightly or loosely coupled. Nope. Just listen for the cue. Listen for the firework to go off. And if that goes off, respond. That's it. Now the cool part is there's tons of data you can put in those fireworks, and those signal passings can carry entire class structures of data content basically as a payload for this message, and you can catch all sorts of cool stuff that way.
Yeah.
But as a general rule of thumb, it's not where my brain goes first for solving any problem. I'll always look for a more direct communication path. Can I intelligently connect these two things? And actually Unity is really nice about that. There's some really cool stuff in Unity for either pre-making those connections when you're setting up the scene, or loosely generating those connections, or making those connections explicitly at runtime by crawling the structure and finding the things that you care about and then storing a reference to those objects in a way that's easier in Unity than most of the other environments I've ever worked in. So there's different tools that will then either set themselves up as listeners or emitters for those messages. So in theory, somebody could make a tool, let's say it's a logging system. And the logging system is just listening for a signal, and you just start spitting stuff into a queue from anywhere in your project. And this logging system will catch them out of the air, log them to an external text file or something like that, and move on.
Yeah.
And so you never have to actually draw a line to the logging system. You just drop the object into the thing and done. It's there. So yeah, and then within that, so once I've got that level of abstraction, the difference between C# events and Unity events, they're basically indistinguishable.
So I guess a lot of my confusion came from just skimming documents too quickly or skimming blogs too quickly, and the fact that there's two different problems that I'm solving at the same time. One is I'm pushing a physical button on the controller, the application menu button, and I want to get an input. I want to generate an event when that happens. So I want to listen for an event and then do something with that. Mm-hmm. And in that case, I'm just unhiding the menu. So I've got the menu deactivated in the inspector, and you click that button and it activates it, and then the menu has a component on it that on enable, it just repositions itself where you're facing and orients itself. So that's the first one. Listen for this event, listen for this physical button. Then the other one with the laser pointer, we're actually fudging a fake input event. So usually with Unity's UI stuff, it listens for events with that event system. It listens for events using Unity events. It listens for mouse and keyboard and gamepad events. It's set up all of those to do natively. The Vive controllers are not part of that schema. Mm-hmm. So with a laser pointer, we're making up a laser pointer that can fake an event, fake a mouse click on the UI, send that to the Unity event system that's attached to the UI button game object, and then call another a game object. And that does call a game object. It doesn't call another script. It calls a property and a component. So you feed in a game object of some kind, and then it gives you a drop down of all the components on that have things you can call on them. It's those two very different ways of doing essentially the same thing were really confusing me. I understand it now after talking about it today, and yeah, it's just it was unpleasant to say the least.
Yeah, so it's I'm reminded of what was it, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where they're explaining the restaurant at the end of the universe and the way all of this works, and he's kind of making this diagram on the table using salt shakers and people's dinner plates and wine glasses. It's so everything that I've just described is completely wrong in every detail, but it's kind of helpful. Mm-hmm. That's how I feel about the event systems. I've wrapped them up in a pretty little picture in my head, and as long as I only interact with the picture, the event systems work perfectly.
Yeah. And now that I've struggled with them for a couple of days, I know how to use them. It'll be another thing in my toolkit, and I won't forget.
Yes, the burned hand teaches best.
Yes, definitely.
I'm just full of the lovely little quotes today, aren't I? I should stop doing that. Or do it more, one or the other, something like that.
We'll make a quote episode. Just you saying semi-profound things.
Other people's semi-profound things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's enough business. Let's talk about VR. What have you been doing in VR lately? Actually, before you answer that question, I do want to apologize to the listener for derailing Dave. So you may notice Dave hasn't had a lot of VR development to talk about. It's because he's become utterly obsessed with graph database theory, and that's kind of my fault for sending him a link to a YouTube video that I thought was interesting.
Yeah, that ended up being a very, very, very deep rabbit hole.
Yeah, it just so happens that this particular graph theory database technology would suit Dave's business application very, very well, which is convenient because he was thinking about rebuilding some of it. So,
Yeah.
hey, before you do that, before you pick a database, check this out.
Hey, here's an interesting new, relatively cutting edge database concept.
Mhm.
What do you think? And I started digging, and then I started digging, and I'm halfway to China by now.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll post a link to that in the show notes because it is a pretty good watch.
If you care about things like databases, it's very, very interesting. If you don't care about databases, the guy's got a really cool presentation style. You should check that out because he's a really good presenter. But aside from that, you won't find it very interesting.
I was told there'd be no math. All right, let's talk about some VR games. What have you been playing or showing other people?
Yeah, so my parents were coming into town.
Nice.
They live, 120 miles away. So they don't end up at my house very often. Most of the time, I end up over at their or down at their place. And as part of coming up and visiting, my father said, "Hey, I want to see some more VR stuff." Okay, cool. Let's do some of that. And so I spent some time. If I'm really going to be doing a big tour, I want to sit down with the software that I want to show people beforehand. And A, make sure it's all updated. And B, make sure I can make it all work. And I've actually been having difficulty recently getting the TP cast functioning properly.
Uh-oh.
And I think I figured out what the problem was now. But the last time I tried taking somebody through VR, it cost me about an hour and a half before they showed up, beating the thing around. And even then, I finally fixed it, but didn't know what I had fixed.
Yeah.
So that was better, but it only gave me a couple of clues that ended up bearing fruit later. So here's the trick. If you recall when I was mentioning with the TP cast before, when you want to use the TP cast, you have to first bring up a TP cast app and tell it to connect to the headset. And then once it's done, then you can really go into Steam and start loading stuff. Now, because I was concerned about that connection there, the next thing that I would bring up is the SteamVR little control panel thing that shows up in the lower right-hand corner. The little green lines and tells you what's working. And it'll then light up and tell you that everything's there and everything's happy. And I'm like, awesome, that's happy. Now I'll go load a game. And I would load a game and none of the video would stream to the goggles. Now, I could look on the screen, and the screen is noticing where the headset is pointed. So the headset's working. I'm just not getting the video into the goggles. And I'm rebooting and updating stuff and messing with things, and absolutely nothing is working. And one time I did things in a slightly different order, and it started working. So here's the trick. Don't load the little VR control panel for SteamVR. Make the TP cast do its connection thing, then go into Steam and start a game. Let the game tell SteamVR to make the connection to the headset. And when you do that, it works great every time. But the difference between those two things that I had thought was a minor one of order turned out to be absolutely critical.
Yeah, because the way I always do it is I start the SteamVR app, put the headset on, go into the SteamVR home, and pick a game. I don't ever pick it out of the Steam app.
Okay.
So that would be like if I were to get a TP cast right now and not have had this conversation, I would think this is totally broken.
Well, maybe not, because when you connect the thing and then start the Steam home, that's probably going to qualify as running an app. That's an app in and of itself.
I'm not starting the Steam app. That just starts when you open the SteamVR tool.
Oh, okay, yeah. Then yes, that might cause a problem. So yeah, I've also been having a problem where I'd gotten in the habit when I was running around in Steam of, okay, I've played this for a while, I want to play something else, and I won't ever actually quit the game I'm playing. I'll just go to another game. And that worked for quite a while, and now for whatever reason, that doesn't work anymore. If I go and try and launch a second game, it'll sit there and blink like it's trying to launch the second game, but the first game will never quit. And I'm hosed. Like, the only way to fix that is literally to quit Steam
Yeah.
and start over. So I fixed that one, or found the path around that one as well, which was when you're done with a game, exit that game, then go do the next game.
No, sometimes even that doesn't work. Sometimes these games just freeze anyway.
Well,
Like, I still have that because I always exit games, and sometimes the game just fails to exit properly.
yeah.
And it will even throw it'll throw an error dialog on the desktop, but it will be behind all other windows, so it won't even come to the forefront. So if you've got like the viewport window and the Steam window and the SteamVR window, and maybe a browser open, it'll be behind all of those things.
Mine will show that dialogue in front, but it only shows it on the desktop. It doesn't provide any message into the headset.
Yeah.
So unless I actually go back into the Steam control panel and say, okay, now show me the desktop, that's the only way I can see that. And usually I end up noticing it when I'm like, nothing's loading, and I take the headset off and look at the screen on the computer. Because I'm not used to bringing up the computer desktop in VR. It's just not a pattern for me.
Yeah.
So anyway, it was a bunch of painful crap that in the end I found paths around all of them. And so now I'm back to being happy again, but it was kind of unhappy with my recent VR experiences for a while. But yeah, hopped in and I found a whole extra 2 panels of brushes and things in Tilt Brush. I had a lot of fun painting with a really wide brush using the duct tape brush.
Cool.
That makes really wide, thin paint strokes that just look neat as like a ribbon going through space. It's a lot of fun running around with those.
Have you found a way? This is a friend asked me this today. Have you found a way when you're drawing something to like be able to start with a very thin ribbon of material and then widen it as you draw and then kind of reduce it down again? Have you seen anything like that?
So on the first screen of brushes on the far left, there are options for like shaped brushes, and they'll do that. It's kind of like a calligraphy brush or a calligraphy pen, but they'll have a tendency to kind of start thin and then taper off at the end.
Okay.
But the thing that I was always noticing was whenever I come into Tilt Brush, it's the middle panel of brushes that's being displayed. And the only thing that acts like a real brush is light in the upper left-hand corner. And everything else is weird crap. And that was where I found things, was I'd never seen the little arrows at the lower left and right corners. And so going over to the left one screen, there's a whole bunch of really cool brushes there. Like actual painting brushes. They look really neat and they got cool effects. And
yeah, I wonder if you just got stuck on that screen because I always saw that one first.
Nope. Every single time I load up Tilt Brush, I have the middle one. So it was like, hey, painting with fire and embers is really neat, but how do I paint? So yeah, that was cool.
So have you published anything on Google Poly?
No.
You can link Tilt Brush to your Google account and then publish from right in the app and share it on, I think it's like poly.google.com.
Yeah, I personally will probably never, ever in my entire life produce something in Tilt Brush that would be worth sharing. Tilt Brush is one of those apps that I want to know how to use as a technological facilitator so that when my art friends come over, I can walk them through it and then just turn them loose and watch them do amazing stuff. But that's me as technology enabler, not as artist. Took my father through Richie's plank experience. It was
before we leave Tilt Brush.
my
friend Patrick came over to try Tilt Brush and Google Blocks today, and I showed him Google Blocks first because I thought Tilt Brush was more impressive, so I figured I'd save that one. And he was pretty impressed with Google Blocks. Doesn't have any 3D modeling background, but he's kind of played with the tools and made some basic stuff and learned how to manipulate shapes and kind of got the hang of it fairly quickly. Didn't make anything that resembled anything at all, but just kind of like playing with clay. And then in Tilt Brush, he was way more impressed by that and just spent like 2 or 3 minutes figuring out what the tools do, and then like, okay, I've got an idea, leave me alone. And like I just went out to the living room and did some reading for a while, and he spent like an hour and a half. I think it was closer to an hour and 45 minutes, just like uninterrupted in the zone making stuff in Tilt Brush. And I'll share a link to what he made because I published it. He published it on my Poly account. But it's just like this. He made 4 or 5 different things, but he only saved one of them in that time. But it's like the Earth, and then there's a large wormhole opening up and a bunch of energy coming out and like swallowing the Earth. And he calls it the last thing they saw. It's kind of cool.
Sold. I want to see.
Yeah. So I'll post a link to that in the show notes. It's pretty cool stuff. And it's just amazing. Like, I'm kind of in the same place as you are with these tools. Like, I would love to be good at this stuff, but like, I look at the tools and I think of like, how would I implement that in an app? I don't think of like, what can I draw with this? And like just seeing him, like I'm sitting here watching him just like flip through the controls and like try different things. Like, I do that same thing, but with like settings, menus, and APIs.
Yes.
Not with artistic tools. So
No.
I don't have that. So anyway, you were about to shove your father off of a tall building.
Yeah. Took Dad through Richie's plank experience, and that was as enjoyable as you would imagine. It's just like it's always interesting to me because everybody's fascinated for about the first 4 minutes, and then they go, "Okay, what else?" And I'm like, "Well, that's kind of it. I mean, there's other stuff, but really, it's kind of it." Let him. He was flying around making smoke trails for far longer than I would have found enjoyable. But yeah, that one's fun. They wanted to see what I played, so I pulled out Quiver. And I play Quiver just rarely enough that every single time I play Quiver, it's a completely different game. It's in pre-release now, and so you give them a month or two in between plays, and they've gone in an entirely different way. So there's new monsters popping up with new behaviors, and what the hell is this guy doing? And okay, let's just keep going. Kill more monsters.
Yeah, Trickster's kind of the same way, where it's getting updated pretty frequently and it's changing a lot. And they've made a lot of improvements, but they've also broken some things along the way. And like recently, I was on a mission, and there was 4 or 5 enemies coming at me from the same place, and one of them stopped, and the other 4 just ran into the same position that the first one stopped in. So I just walked over with one sword and killed all 5 of them with one hit. It was kind of great. Like, yeah, they're not really supposed to overlap like that.
Did you file a bug report?
No, it's a great way to win. So.
Okay, there you go. Functions as intended. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then I purchased it quite a while ago, probably during one of the Steam summer sale. I just never actually sat down and played with the Fantastic Contraption. And finally dusted that off, and that was a lot of fun. The weirdest part was working on my contraption, and I found myself ducking around it.
Yeah.
Or carefully high stepping so I could step over the thing to get to the other side of it.
Have you found the helmet yet?
I found the helmet, yes.
Have you used the helmet?
A little bit.
I just thought that was a really cool way of doing things. Where you put a helmet on and the scene changes, but the scene doesn't really change. You just put on another scene in your head.
I was kind of disturbed that the way you move the little cat palette around was by grabbing its butthole.
No, you don't have to grab its butt. You can grab it anywhere.
Oh, every other place I grabbed it, it wasn't moving. But grabbing the butthole worked.
You can also just, I think, pull the trigger and it comes toward you.
It was like a double click on the trigger made it come towards you, I think.
Yeah, it does fart when it arrives, though.
That, too. Yes, the cat was a little disturbing. Of course, if you don't have to grab it by the butthole to move it around, then I guess I was just accidentally making it more disturbing. But the cat was pretty disturbing.
Nice. The app did catch me cheating at one point. I tried to make a really long pole and then just like stick the little object to it and like throw it at the goal,
Uh-huh.
and it detected cheating and me like it forced me to throw my contraption into the volcano and kind of like scolded me a little bit.
Oh, really?
It's like, put the helmet on, okay. Now pick up your contraption. Okay, now throw it in the volcano. Okay, now you're gonna take the helmet off.
I mean, I tried knocking over the thing with just a stick, and there was a kind of a little circular plane that popped up that just kind of showed me, no, you can't interact with anything beyond this point. But I didn't try throwing anything at it.
Well, I threw it with the contraption itself. So like I made a little wheeled contraption.
Oh, you made a launcher.
Yeah, essentially.
Oh, wow.
But it was outside of the rules.
I am so much a software guy and not a hardware guy that by the time I got done with almost the most simple of tutorials, I was already realizing that I'm not going to get very far in the Fantastic Contraption. It's one of those games that's going to stump me very, very quickly because my brain just doesn't work the way that game works. I love the interactions. I love the fantastic stuff, but I'm pretty sure that game is going to outpace me very quickly.
Yeah. I've only played a couple of levels on it. A friend of mine played through like half of it, I think, in a couple of hours. Same thing with Cat Sorter VR, which is a delightful Mr. Potato Head style game where you've got broken cats coming down a conveyor belt and you've got to fix them, and you've got like a bunch of cat parts behind you. So, you know, a cat could come through with like a peg leg and you've got to give it a real leg, or this cat has bat wings, or this cat has a butthole for an eye. Like, you just got to take these parts off and put real parts in the right place and feed them down the conveyor belt. And it's hilarious. And I immediately gave them money as soon as they launched. Like it's just a no-brainer. And I played it for a couple of minutes and looked around. And, you know, I played it for a couple of minutes several times, but it's not something I spent a lot of time in. But a friend of mine comes over and plays it for an hour and a half and just zones out.
Yeah, I was also having difficulty. I mean, part of the thing that I have to do is I have to go back and like read online to figure out how some of the interactions in Fantastic Contraption work. Because during the tutorial, whatever I was doing was making the thing happy too fast. So like, oh, here's how you break a stick into two sections, or like make the stick bend. And I'm like, but I have no idea what button I pressed to make it happen. They were just like, here's how you, thank you, congratulations, now we're moving on. I'm like, wait, whoa, how is that? And I still don't have any idea what the blue noodles do.
Yeah, me neither.
I mean, there's the sticks, and I got the sticks, but there's the blue ones, and I'm like, what? I haven't been able to figure out what the physical characteristics of the stupid things are. So, I'll have to do some reading, and it'll almost undoubtedly end up manifesting as a cheat or two, where somebody will explain, oh, well, you could use it to do X or Y. I'll be like, oh, okay.
Yeah, just watch a YouTube video, somebody playing it.
Yeah.
So the other game I've been playing is Solaris Project. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But it's a pretty cool game. I started it last summer and then I kind of forgot about it, so I restarted it this week. But without giving too much away, basically it's a survival game on an alien planet where some circumstances have left you on this planet and now you've got to survive. And you start with basically just like a handheld device, and this device can help you like scan your environment. You can collect items, and it's got a crafting system. But like your first order of business is just like get cover immediately. Okay, find water. Okay, find food. Find fire. Like real primitive stuff. And then there's like messages scattered around. There's definitely some kind of alien presence on this world, but I haven't been introduced to it yet. And there's like additional abilities that you can unlock the longer you go, but it's pretty easy to die. Like I didn't find food. I was just like having fun exploring the environment because the landscapes are really well done. And this is all done in Unreal Engine. And just, you know, kind of zooming around, looking at the foliage and the trees and the water effects, things like that. And then I starved to death and died. And then, I restarted and kept looking around, and I realized I could climb this cliff and kind of explore the rest of the place I was on. And then I forgot that I was supposed to be looking for food and got the indication that I was going to starve to death. So I jumped off the cliff, which had a pretty nice animation. I did fall away to the ground, and like showed me falling to the ground, and then my helmet broke, and like I could hear myself dying. Like, that's actually pretty well done. So yeah, fun game. It may be that kind of go-to game for VR that I have for a while. Since I've been looking for something like that the last couple of weeks. Well, that's all I have for this week.
Okay.
Anything else from you?
Nope. Not unless you want to talk about graph databases for a couple hours.
That's another podcast.
That's our show for today. You can follow us on Twitter. I'm VRHermit_Dave.
And I'm VRHermit_Joe. If you get a chance, please like us in your podcast player of choice, or leave a review on iTunes, and tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening.